Welcome to the To Climb a Mountain, an indie author's journey podcast with your host, Riley Morrison. This is part 2 of the episode, Get an Editor. And P.S. to this episode, it's actually really hot here today, so you can probably see me sweating. Oh, and there's also a fire somewhere nearby too, so we've got helicopters with dropping water nearby, so hey, welcome to Australia. There was something I quickly wanted to add, and I'll probably do a video on this at some point, and that is how I got my editing done and spread it over 9 months rather than all at once. I basically just thought of it as a bill each month. I'd add a couple of chapters to have developmentally edited, so I'd only pay say 30, 40, I can't remember how much per month to get those chapters edited, rather than all at once where it would have been very expensive. So that's something I'm going to do a video on, how you can get it developmentally edited over a period of time rather than all at once. But you'll probably have to find an editor willing to do that because it's not the optimal way to do it. With that said, let's get on with the show. As I go over the synopsis of the chapter, I'm going to play the original chapter in the background so you can see the editor's comments, though most of them obviously no longer apply to the book. The synopsis I'm going through is the original chapter before the editor's comments. First, I want to give a brief synopsis of the original chapter 12 before I had the editor's feedback on it. The chapter is in Eamon's point of view, Eamon being one of the main characters of the book, heir to a lost son. Kara is the other main character. The chapter starts with Eamon sitting at a window thinking to himself. He's worried about Kara, who has been gravely wounded, and he's lamenting he did not do more to save her. They were attacked by the bad guys of the book, basically, and she was gravely wounded and is now unconscious. He's also talking about a new character that has yet to be introduced in the book called Minard, who has been obviously really irritating Eamon and pushing his buttons. This inner dialogue goes on for a couple of paragraphs, and then Kara wakes screaming from her unconsciousness. He runs over to her, and at first she doesn't know who he is. She has bandages over her eyes so she can't see, and he starts thinking about how wasted she looks since she's been injured. She's pretty gravely wounded, her hair's turned white, her eyes have turned white too, so she looks like she's blind. Eventually she understands that it's him, and she starts calming down and stops fighting him. He quickly explains what happened to her, how she was wounded, and how some of the monks that were protecting her were killed. She was wounded by a poisoned javelin and has been unconscious for days. In self-reflection, he thinks how he regrets taking her to the temple because the patriarch, the head of the temple, thinks her a threat. Minard, the monk he was thinking about at the beginning of the chapter, bursts into the room, and there's a humorous conversation between Eamon and Minard, and it implies that Minard is trying to muscle his way in between Eamon and Kara, who Eamon loves Kara, and she has some feelings for him too, so it starts a sort of love triangle dynamic, or at least the threat of one. Minard makes Eamon leave to get the healer, because Minard has to stay and guard Kara. Eamon retrieves the healer and returns and sees Minard and Kara touching, and he's very angry about this. And he moves to confront Minard, but the healer pushes him out of the way. The healer is a named character called Quenwi, though she is unimportant to the overall story. Kara lets the healer check her over, and she starts relating what happened to her when she was unconscious. She had a dream and saw lots of stuff in it. The healer is clearly disturbed with what Kara is saying and says the patriarch will have to deal with it. So she gets Minard to go get the patriarch. The patriarch, as I said, is the head of the temple. The patriarch enters and is clearly hostile. At first he seems nice to Kara, asking how she feels, that type of stuff, but then he soon blames her for the enemy who has been attacking the human kingdom and destroying the cities, which is the overarching bad guy of the series. He says that she's part of an ancient prophecy and that her coming has been foretold. Before he can say more or have her taken away, another character bursts into the room, and it's clearly described as the man who was the inciting incident of the book and the man who clearly started it all. And then the chapter cuts off on that cliffhanger. Alright, I'm now going to go through the final critique the editor left me for the entire book. It was a pretty long document. These were her notes on chapter 12. This goes straight on from her comments on earlier chapters, so it starts abruptly. After that, I have some ideas for restructuring chapter 12 through 14 to improve their flow and pacing. First, I'd suggest not having Kara wake up until the middle of chapter 12 rather than the beginning. Since Kara's vision dream in the previous chapter is quite long and involved, I would think it would be fitting for readers to feel like she's been asleep for a long time rather than just being told through Eamon's thoughts that it's been 4 or 5 days. A vision dream, by the way, was something Kara was having while she was unconscious after the javelin wound. Also, this would give you an opportunity to introduce Minard a little more clearly. As is, his appearance feels abrupt and rushed, and establish his initial relationship with Eamon before Kara is involved. This will give readers the opportunity to see Eamon's bitterness, insecurity increase once Kara is added to the mix, and would also act as a baseline to possibly return to once jealousy over Kara no longer plays a role in the relationship between Minard and Eamon. My second suggestion for these chapters involves the manner in which Kara wakes up from her vision dream. Rather than just having her wake up suddenly and unremarkably, I think you should take the scene from chapter 14 where Kara disappears from her room and is found in the chapel and use it in chapter 12 instead. That scene unnecessarily complicates and bogs down chapter 14, which would work better without the added conflict, since that line of conflict felt like it was resolved in chapter 13 and readers will be eager for the group to get going. It would work better in chapter 12, where it would not only make Kara's awakening much more exciting, it would also lead in perfectly to the Patriarch's anger and interrogation of Kara. If you were to make these changes, you would probably need to omit the scene in which Kara's eye bandages are removed, and also the unnecessary conversation between Kara and Quenwy. Instead, that's something Eamon could mention Quenwy did while Kara was still asleep. Then when Kara opens her eyes after waking from the vision dream in the chapel, you could take a moment for Eamon to be shocked by the appearance of her eyes, but glad that she can see. As for Winrick, which was the man who was the inciting incident, his appearance at the end of chapter 12 can remain as is, and then it goes on into the next chapters. Alright, I'm now going to go into the new chapter synopsis after changing it based on the editor's feedback. The main points that are now changed is that there's more conflict in the chapter, more foreshadowing of future events, more movement, as in the characters aren't just hanging around in the one room. The chapter still starts at the window with Eamon in self-reflection. There's more conflict added to his self-reflection. And there's more detail about Minard and Eamon's relationship up until this point, so that eases the reader in on Minard's introduction. Kara remains asleep, and Eamon thinks how withered she looks and how much she's changed. He describes the way she's changed. Her eyes are now grey, and her hair is now white, and he laments bringing her to the temple and goes through what he should have done instead. The people at the temple obviously think she's a threat, and he feels like he's brought her into danger. Around now, Minard comes in. Some of this funny exchange happens between him and Eamon, and Minard is clearly trying to bait Eamon to anger. He even sort of flirts with Kara even though she's asleep, just to make Eamon angry, basically. Eventually, Minard tells Eamon he has to leave and that the Patriarch wants to see Kara. Eamon is absolutely horrified by this, as he knows the Patriarch thinks Kara a threat and is worried what he's going to do to her. Eventually, Minard drags Eamon out of the room and takes him to a prison cell and leaves him there. In the prison cell, Eamon feels weak and defenseless and a deep guilt for bringing Kara to her doom. Then there's a new scene. Minard bursts into the room and asks Eamon if he's seen Kara. Of course, Eamon hasn't because he's been in the prison cell, so they go back to Kara's room and find her gone. Supposedly she's gone missing in the time that Eamon was away. Soon the Patriarch enters and is introduced as an angry and unstable man. There is clearly conflict between Minard and the Patriarch, as well as deep hostility. After a brief discussion with the Patriarch that ends with Eamon and Minard being forced to stay in Kara's room, the Patriarch leaves, and Eamon asks what the conflict was about, and Minard basically explains how there's a rift in the order but doesn't go into too many details other than to name the head of the reformers who are breaking apart from the order at the temple. Then they just basically wait for Kara to be found. New scene, she's been found in the chapel, and when Eamon gets to the chapel, he finds the monks and the patriarch looming menacingly around her, and he obviously pushes past them and goes to Kara, and after she comes to, because originally she didn't know where she was or anything, she basically describes some of the things that she saw while unconscious and hints at the greater threats and the greater plot of the series. Obviously, the patriarch doesn't take too kindly to this, but Eamon convinces the patriarch to back down by standing up to him and doing something incredibly brave, to standing face to face with one of the most powerful men in this world. So that builds Eamon's character and shows that even though he's weak, he's still willing to stand up for what he believes in. Then there's a new scene. They're back in Kara's room, and Kara is given no time to recover. The healer, who is there now quickly checking over her, is now a nameless character, so is no longer called Quenwi, and is relegated to just minimal speech. This is where the patriarch again, like in the original chapter, goes into detail of how Kara is a threat, bringing up an ancient prophecy where she's mentioned, and that the enemy who's destroying the human cities elsewhere is actually is there because of her. As this conversation happens, there's clearly three factions in the conversation with their own agendas. There's the patriarch, and by extension the rest of the order. Then there's Minard, who sort of represents the reformers, the breakaway segment of the order. And then there's obviously Kara and Eamon, who feel isolated and threatened. They're encircled by enemies. At one point, Kara says the patriarch sounds much like the primary antagonist up to this point of the story, which is a man named Kahan, who has been trying to kill her since chapter 1, and that their language they use when they speak about her and that she basically has to die sounds very similar. So it implies that Kara has run away from one enemy into the arms of another. And then, like the original chapter, it ends with the inciting incident man bursting into the room, and after a brief description of him so the reader knows exactly who it probably is, it ends on that cliffhanger. That man hadn't been in the book since chapter 1, and the reader might have thought he was dead. So there you go, what a developmental editor can do for your book. It certainly helped me, and I'm sure it can help you. As I briefly mentioned at the start, there are ways to get it done without all the cost being up front, and I'm going to do a video on this at some stage. Because developmental editing can be expensive, but it's certainly worth it, especially if it's your first book. Probably later on, once you know the ropes of writing, you might not need it done, but it certainly helps for your first book and you'll learn so much from doing it. So the message still stands: get an editor. Go and take care.